And I say that because you see some very conflicting networks, right? Yes, exactly. I've always said, never judge a reporter on the network that they work for, judge them on their reports. Because I have seen good reporters and not so great reporters on each one of these networks. And we are in a world right now where we're in an information overload. And it's not necessarily in a good way, meaning we're overloaded with information that's going to make our world better because we're understanding the world more. No, we're in an information overload of not necessarily false news. In fact, I am a big believer that, yes, we might not agree with certain channels or mediums or newspapers, and we think that they're lying, but they're not all necessarily lying to you. In fact, they might be telling you something that is true. They're giving you a bit of the truth, but they're omitting a large part of the truth to fit what they want their narrative to be, to fit what they think their viewers want to hear or their readers want to read. That makes the job for all of us as consumers trying to figure out what's going on in the world, what's going on in the news, much more difficult. Because that means we have to get this bit, we have to get that bit, we have to find this, we have to find that, we have to find this to get the bigger picture and not necessarily the full picture. It's really difficult to get the full picture unless you're living it, you're seeing it, and even then, that's from your lens, and maybe not from the lens of the person sitting next to you. But we'll go into that a bit. So I want to give you just a glimpse of what my life was like as a journalist.
Thousands of outraged Afghans are protesting the U.S. and the burning of the Korans for a fourth straight day. Our NBC News correspondent Atia Abawi was in the Capitol when gunfire broke out during one of her reports.
Right now, the protesters have gotten out of hand. The Afghan army is trying to stop them. They're firing off warning shots, but we nearly got stuck in the protest and we have to run.
Actually just found an IED, an improvised explosive device, down at the intersection there, and what they're about to do is detonate it.
So a little fun fact about that last one. I was on an embed with the Marines, meaning I was with a unit of the Marines as they were in battle in a place called Marja. And there were roadside bombs everywhere. In fact, they called it the biggest minefield in NATO's history that we were going into. And we were told that when we air assault in, when we jump out of the helicopter, you're going to be shot at, but don't run, because you risk standing on a landmine and it exploding and you dying that way. Every single person I was with in that unit stepped on that IED, that roadside bomb. But luckily, it wasn't one that detonates when you step on it. It was a remote detonator, and that person who was supposed to detonate it, thankfully, was not nearby when we stepped on that. Who in this room was in the Intro to Journalism class this morning? Okay, I see a couple hands up. So the story that I was telling you guys about me running and us running away as we were being shot at, that was the first story. And I'm going to give some background to all of you because there's a lot more people who didn't hear that story. As a journalist, I was blessed to meet a lot of great journalists who went into it because it might be idealistic, but we thought maybe we can make a difference, we can figure out what's going on, we can share the story the right way. Unfortunately, I also met a lot of journalists who got into it for ego. It was about their fame, not the stories that they were telling. And that first one where we were running, I remember when I got back to the house and we were doing live shots, meaning I was on MSNBC and the nightly news later. We had little earpieces, and everyone in New York was saying, I'm so glad you're okay, I'm so glad you're okay. But this is something that I do on a daily basis. I've been shot at before, I've run from bullets before, and I found out that apparently I had a colleague who was much higher level as well, but apparently he used to have videos like this, and then when they would rewind the video, they'd find him being like, oh my God, we're getting shot at, we're getting shot at. And he's like, oh, you know what, let's do this again. Let's do this again. Oh, we're getting shot at, we're getting shot at. So they questioned every journalist who went through something like that and would rewind the tape, and they found out this was actually a real situation. Yeah, so that was a little fun fact, and I wanted the intro to journalism class to realize that's the story I was talking about. So as a journalist, many people might not see this, but I saw it as a blessing. I got to live in Afghanistan for 4.5 years. I got to live in Jerusalem for 6 years. I got to see what you guys see on the news all the time and might see as very scary, sketchy places with some really bad people. What I did is I lived there and I got to see that the majority of the people in these places are kind people, good people, people with families who want normal lives the way we have normal lives-ish. You know, I think no one's life is fully normal. But it was a blessing. And I know we have our stereotypes about these places, and some of them are based on truths. Yes, when you think of Afghanistan, who thinks of oppression, especially of women? I'm putting my hand up because the Taliban have taken over. They are oppressing women. It's true. Obviously, Jerusalem has its issues. We've all seen that in the news as well. I think of the amazing people I met there. There are good and bad people everywhere, just like here. As a journalist, I had maybe 2 minutes, if I was lucky, on CNN or Al Jazeera to tell a story. There were times on nightly news I had 41 seconds to share a story. Again, when we go back to stereotypes, it's because as a journalist, I couldn't give you the full picture. I couldn't tell you why the war was going on. I could only give you updates of the war. I couldn't tell you why there was a conflict going on in the Middle East, the history lesson behind it, the dynamics and the nuances. If I got to write a .com piece, I had 750 words. That's definitely not enough to share the story. So when I had the opportunity to write books, I wrote what I call realistic fiction in the English class. I see some of you here too. We talked about this already. As a journalist, I lost my imagination. That's a good thing. Unfortunately, today we're seeing a lot of journalists who use their imagination, which is a bad thing. And sadly, it's getting more common. But covering the stuff that I covered, which included the Iraq War, the war in Afghanistan, the conflicts in the Middle East and other places, I lost my imagination. So when I had the opportunity to write a book, I thought to myself, how am I going to do this? And I realized I've had the privilege to go to places where the majority of us can't go to. I got to go to villages in Afghanistan. I got to go to Kabul. I got to meet Afghan men and women and children. I got to talk to them, to get to know them, to find out that the girls and the women there giggle the way that we giggle with our friends here. The boys play rough with each other there. They go to the gym. They flex their muscles. I can't tell you how many people are on Instagram in Afghanistan right now that love to show you their gym pictures. I got to see all this. I got to see the mountains. I got to smell the smells, see the sights, hear the sounds. So I realized I can put all of this together into a novel. So everything I've written in my novels are based on real people, real experiences, real places that I've just brought into a fictionalized story. But it's the truth. Because again, I'm writing about people that I feel a huge responsibility to make sure that I'm telling their stories correctly, and a huge responsibility to whoever decides to pick up the books. Because I realize not everyone wants to read about Afghanistan. Not everyone wants to read about the Syrian refugee crisis, but those who do pick up the book, they want to know what's going on, so I want to give them the truth. What many people might not know about me is that I was born a refugee myself. My mother was 8 months pregnant with me when they had to escape from Afghanistan. I was born a month later in Germany. In fact, this picture right here is from my refugee papers. And this here is when we came to America. I was 1 when we came to America, and I got my resident alien card, and I've convinced my kids that they're half alien, and they believe it because it's a government document. So if you do ever meet them, don't tell them the truth, although my 11-year-old is catching on. But for the longest time, he's like, I still haven't told my friends that we're aliens. But yeah. But a lot of people don't know is that Afghanistan, where my family is from, was completely different from what we see today. It's completely different from what you expect the past to be. In fact, this picture I posted on Facebook probably more than a decade ago, and it's gone viral on what Afghanistan used to be like. That's my grandmother, the third one right here. That's my great-grandmother, and these are my great-aunts. This is my mom with my older cousin in Kabul, and this was my dad. Afghanistan was a safe place when they lived there. We think of Afghanistan, we think of 20 years of war, right? Afghanistan has been going through 40 years of war. But prior to that, it was like this. In fact, we talk about the oppression of women, right? Well, believe it or not, my mother was the breadwinner. When my mom and dad got married, my mother was the top accountant for Ariana Airlines at the time, which was a partner airline with an airline called Pan Am. Does anyone here know Pan Am? I see. Oh, wow, we see some younger hands up too. That's impressive. So Pan Am was an American airline, but it was global. Like, it reached everywhere, including 1960s, 70s Afghanistan. They partnered with these airlines. So my mom was the top accountant. She told my dad, go follow your dreams. My dad decided to be a photographer one day. He wanted to be a journalist the next day. He ended up working at a ministry one day. He did his thing, and she was happy to take care of him. But war changes everything. And these two pictures were taken on the same spot. So we see that destruction, right? Look at this beautiful garden that just gets completely destroyed. We see the visuals, but we don't know about what happens internally with the people. And I'm going to give you 2 examples. How people that you know and you trust can turn on you, and how complete strangers can become your saviors. So I mentioned my mom worked for Ariana Airlines, top accountant. It was time to leave. The war was getting bad. Both my grandfathers, meaning my mom's father and my dad's father, were generals. Pre-communism. Communism took over. They were imprisoned because they worked for the military, for the previous government. When they were released eventually, my mother said to my father, my brother was 2, she was pregnant with me, as I mentioned, she said, it's time to leave. And my dad said, well, I'm not leaving. This is my country. This is where I'm from. This was their foundation. This is all they knew. And my mother said, okay, you don't have to leave, but me, my son, and my unborn child were leaving. My dad eventually did say, oh, I guess I'm leaving too. So when you think that Afghan women are weak, I'm going to tell you they're the fiercest. And that's the only reason why the Taliban tries to control them the way they do, because the women could take over, and they should, to be honest. But they love to use their knowledge. Unfortunately, the Taliban loves to use their weapons. So it was my mom's job, because she worked for the airlines, to get the tickets to leave, and my dad said he'd work on getting the visas. So my mother had to go to her Afghan Ariana boss to get an okay to leave. She said they were going on vacation because that was the only way to leave during communism. You couldn't say that I'm leaving forever, I'm not coming back. They wouldn't let you leave the country if you said that. The Afghan boss signs off, then she goes to the Pan Am American side, and the boss looks at her and says, "You're not coming back, are you?" And my mother was not a very good liar then. She's not a very good liar now. In fact, if she looked at my outfit right now, she'd tell me that I look horrendous. So if you're thinking that, my mother would agree. The outfit's not doing it. So my mom looked at him and said, "What are you talking about?" And he said, he signed her paper and said, "I wish you and your family an amazing life." That gentleman did that for about a dozen other families that worked at Ariana, and it was a few years later she found out that he was killed by the communists for helping people like my mother and my family. Example of a stranger helping you out. My father's job was to get the visa. So he took the passports in, he'd go in, and every day at the passport office they would say, "Come back tomorrow, it's not ready." Every day he would go, "Come back tomorrow, it's not ready." After about 6 months of this, one person in the office felt sorry for him and said, "You're never getting your passports back. Someone's blocking you. You have to go higher up than us." My dad eventually found someone within the ministry, was able to get the visas, was able to get the passport back, and found out through that gentleman that the person that was blocking them was his own cousin, who was a member of the Communist Party, and was mad that my dad and mother wouldn't join, and realized that, hey, if you give them their passports, they're not coming back. I mean, which was true, but what's it to him? He was mad they weren't communists with them. This is just an example. These are some examples on how it's more than just this. It's more than just destruction. It's relationships get destroyed. When I was in Iraq, I had an amazing producer named Mohammed, just fun-loving, giggly guy, and he was telling me how his neighbor and him grew up as brothers. He would go over his house for dinner, sleep over, vice versa. When the war started, there was a division between the sects that they lived in. And he still saw his neighbor as a brother, and he went up to him and he just said, "Just so you know, I still see you as my brother." And this boy that he grew up with as a brother turned to him and said, "If you ever talk to me again, I will kill you." It's the changes that come, the divisions that destroy not just the land, but the people. So eventually we made it to Germany. And, you know, being refugees, being an immigrant, being someone new in a country is not always easy. You have people who accept you and you have people who don't accept you. In fact, my mother always has a story of that when we were in a small village in Germany where I was born, she would take us out in the stroller, my brother walking. One day, you know, a German family would give my brother a little ice cream and smile. The next day, someone would spit in their direction and just call them like damn foreigners. You know, it's not unique to that village in Germany. We've had that here. And I feel like there are people in this room who have similar stories within their families. Unfortunately, life for a refugee and immigrant, and for a lot of us, isn't always perfect. You're welcomed by some and not by others. And honestly, growing up in America, I was considered a dual citizen of both Afghanistan and America. I called myself a dual foreigner. Because again, I have people who accept me here, and I still have people who don't. When I went back to Afghanistan, someone said, the second that you put foot on that land, you're going to feel connected. I set foot on that land, and it felt like land. And I figured out quite quickly that there were Afghans who called me sister, who saw me as a sister, who was, "We're so glad you're back, this is your country." I had Afghans who used derogatory language towards me because they said that your family left, you're not a part of us, you guys are traitors. So for a little while I thought, okay, being a dual foreigner, I feel so left out. Who here feels left out sometimes? Yes, exactly. And you don't just have to be a foreigner to feel left out, or feel different, or feel othered by someone. In fact, who here doesn't ever feel that way? It's okay if you put your hand up. I've had sessions where people put their hand up. Okay, I see a hand. Good for you, admitting it, and I appreciate that. But I also want you to remember that the moment that you do feel, because there's going to be a time that you're going to feel different, you're going to feel othered, and you're going to take that personally, and you may want to get angry about it. But I just want you to remember that all those hands that were up to say that they felt like that most of their lives, some of their lives, it's something that's not unique to one person. It happens to all of us. And when you come to that moment one day, I just want you to remember that you're not alone in feeling that way. So it's better to feel a sense of community and empathy and connection than it is to get angry that it's making you feel different. Because again, like I said, that's what connects us as humans. So as a journalist, as I mentioned, there are stories that stick with you. I'm trying to see with the time, so I might have to speed this up a bit. I usually like to talk and go into some of these stories. So this little boy, he was 14. I met boys as young as 10 and 9 and 8 who were brainwashed into becoming suicide bombers. I call it brainwashing because no one in their right mind thinks it's a good idea until someone convinces you. In fact, the 8 and 9-year-olds, when I spoke to them at a juvenile facility, they were playing with a soccer ball and told me that the person who told them to do it gave them a talisman and said, "Oh, when you click the button, the talisman will save you. It'll only take the bad people." These girls were at a women's shelter in Kabul. None of these women's shelters exist anymore. In fact, when I did this story, there was only 12 in all of Afghanistan for 35 million people. And yes, the Taliban are oppressive, but Afghan women didn't have an easy life even before the Taliban. In fact, the UN statistic, so keep in mind this is a conservative number, said that 90% of Afghan women suffered from some sort of domestic abuse. 35 million population, 90% conservative estimates saying they suffered some sort of abuse, and there were only 12 shelters. I believe by the fall of Kabul, there was about 17 throughout the whole country. Now there are none, because the Taliban had labeled women's shelters as brothels, so making them a target. This is Anthony D'Alessio. I met him when I was embedded with the Marines, a group of Marines who were not excited to have a female reporter, a reporter at all, but a female reporter with a female camera woman who was a bit nutty, I should say, and I say this with all due respect because I knew her, but she was nutty. In fact, after that air assault and after getting past all those roadside bombs that we had to get past on the first day, there were a lot of Marines who were very skeptical about these reporters that were with them. The very first person that opened up to me was Anthony. I was really nervous walking to the food area, but I was hungry, so I had to pass by all these Marines, and I picked up an MRE bag, which is a meal ready-to-eat bag, and I started opening it, and I just heard a voice say, "I wouldn't eat that, that's gonna make you fat." And I was like, okay. And he walked over and he started asking me about my life, so I started asking him about his life. He was a first-generation Italian whose mother had left the family, and he had 5 siblings that he was helping raise. And he came, obviously he joined the Marines and he came to Afghanistan, but he was excited to get back to his family, to his fiance. He was really young. He was 19, but engaged. A lot of Marines do that when they go into the towns where they're getting their training. But after Anthony started talking to me, the other Marines saw that he was speaking with me, so they started opening up. And I got to get to know these, I'd say, young men for the next 2 weeks as I was covering their stories, as I was covering the war. In fact, when I left about 2 weeks later, I felt guilty because they were staying, and I got to know a lot about their lives back home, what their families were like. It was about a few months later, I got a message from one of the Marines, and he had told me that Anthony, on his day off, volunteered to go on patrol to pass out teddy bears and blankets. It was an operation to win hearts and minds. But while they were doing that, there was a Taliban sniper, and he was able to shoot Anthony in the head, unfortunately killing him. I share these stories because these are real people. Like, we see the numbers, we hear about war. War is bad, yes it is. Real people are dying on both sides. Civilians, service members, families suffer on all sides. And again, I found it really difficult as a reporter not to share it in a fuller perspective. The Secret Sky, the first book I wrote based on a village that I went to in Afghanistan. Every detail is based on that village, but also goes into the tug-of-war of the peaceful practice of Islam in Afghanistan for 1,000 or so years, to suddenly in the last several decades, this conservative fundamentalist form coming in, and how even in the villages they're still struggling to fix it. For my second book on the Syrian refugee crisis, I was living in Jerusalem. My editor wanted me to write a book about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I was doing my research, and as I'm doing my research, the news is flooding in, and I'm watching Syrian mothers pushing strollers on the sides of European highways, and all I can think about was my own mother and the choice she had to make for me and my brother. And as these mothers are doing this, risking their lives, families risking their lives on dinghies like that, people are calling them horrible things. People are calling them terrorists. People are calling them scum that are going to ruin their countries, when really they're just trying to survive. They're literally dying to survive. So I asked my editor, because I was in my apartment, my warm apartment, holding my new little baby, my infant, thinking if my mother didn't make that choice, I wouldn't be here right now. And I genuinely believe that none of us would have survived if my parents didn't make that choice to leave. The same choices that they were all making here. So my editor told me that if I could keep my deadline, I can write about the refugee crisis. So I kept the deadline. I wrote about it. I flew to Greece. I flew to Turkey. I interviewed refugees. I approached this as a journalist in the same way that I wrote about Afghanistan, making sure the details are truthful to the people I'm writing about, but also truthful to the people who are willing to pick up the book and read it. Because again, my responsibility is to them and to the reader. This is a landfill of life jackets in Lesbos Island, Greece. The majority of these life jackets are fake. Because in the worst time of someone's life, there are a lot of people who are there to take advantage of them, nefarious people who want to profit by selling them life jackets that don't work, dinghies with holes in them Sadly, in situations that could be this worst situation of your life, you can run into people who are trying to make that situation beneficial to them and not you. Refugee numbers have continued to go up, as we saw with Afghanistan, as we saw with Ukraine, and I want to emphasize this can happen overnight. My husband was in Ukraine for CNN before the war started. In fact, he was there for 2 weeks and nothing was happening. He was going out to restaurants, seeing the nightlife in Kyiv and Lviv. In fact, he told CNN, I have another project coming up because he's a freelancer. He's like, can I leave? And CNN actually said to him, the war's not even going to happen. I think you're fine. Just leave. It was 2 days later that the war broke out. The Ukrainians themselves didn't think it would happen. And then overnight, we saw millions of more refugees. The numbers continue to go up. Displaced. Who knows the difference between displaced and refugee? So refugee is when you leave the border of your country. Displaced can mean going from one city to another. And I know Floridians know this with hurricanes. When you leave, when a house is destroyed, 4 minutes. Oh, sorry. Okay, sorry, I'm going to rush this. So my point being is these numbers are going to go up. We're seeing it all over the world, and we're seeing it here as well. In fact, in 2024, we had a record high, 11 million Americans displaced. Those numbers went up in 2025. They're still waiting on the statistics. Again, I'm going to rush this over, but war, persecution, natural disasters, environmental crisis, poverty, everything is leading to the problems that we see, people taking advantage. And I want to emphasize that no country is immune. Our biggest enemy is fear. And I want to say that it's human nature to be afraid of what you don't know. People that you don't know, countries that you don't know much about. But when you don't go out of your way to try to understand, that fear often turns to hate and the divisions that we see in the world. But if you take that one little step to try to understand someone, to make this, and again, English students, we heard this earlier, but we have stereotypes that are put into our heads. Sometimes we put it in ourselves. Quite often it's given by someone else. We have these flattened views of people we think are different from us. But when we take that extra step to see the depth within them, we see glimpses of ourselves. We see those human connections. And we can prevent these divisions. Unfortunately, there are a lot of people who profit off these divisions, gain power off of these divisions, and there's nothing better for them, for us to continue with these stereotypes, to see each other as others and not as a community. Should I end this now so I can open up to some questions? I mean, I feel like there's so much more that I can talk about, but I've taken up too much of your time. Just to say, when you talk to someone, when you try to empathize with someone, that doesn't mean just hearing them and preparing your argument to go against them. It means to actually listen to them. And you deserve that same respect. I'm not saying to let someone walk all over you, because if someone is saying that they're listening to you, but they're preparing their argument, they're not empathizing with you. But it is important to try to open up your heart and your mind to see someone else's perspective, to get out of those echo chambers, to get out of that algorithm that you're on, to try to see it from their perspective, but they need to give you the same courtesy. Sorry.
Well, while we do not have time for questions now, just a reminder that our 2 upper school journalism classes will be having lunch with Ms. Abawi in just a moment, and I feel sure there will be questions there, and I think we all owe a big thank you.
Sorry. Thank you.
And you are dismissed.
Just hearing the
breathing. And you're gonna have you need to sit down. That was amazing. And I'm so sorry if they come in a little bit faster, but there's nothing to say. You sure? Absolutely. So you unmiked, and I'm gonna head over real quick with you, and then I've got to get Maria straight here. Oh yeah,
I can walk over if you need to get Maria straight. I think I
okay,
figured
Miss.
it out.
Yeah, Erin will be there. Okay. Oh goodness. You gave them. They need.